What's going on, guys? It's Cimoooooooo. So today I wanted to do a discussion on Lynx summoning because it's actually been just over a year since Lynx summoning was first released. Can you guys believe that? It wasn't that long ago that there was this massive outcry that Yu-Gi-Oh was doomed because Lynx summoning was gonna ruin the game forever. So I thought it'd be a cool idea today to look back at how Yu-Gi-Oh actually used to be before Lynx summoning was implemented and kind of map the evolution to kind of see how we got to where we are now and how Lynx summoning has basically just taken over as the dominating summoning mechanic of the game that we know and love. But before we get into that, I want to give a huge shout out to my newest patrons as always. So big shout outs today to Eric. You are the reason that this channel is growing strong. And if you guys want to help support me in the channel through Patreon, then check out the Patreon link in the description below. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into it. So if you're a newer player or if it's been that long that you don't remember how the game used to be, before Lynx summoning was released, and when I'm talking about released, I'm talking about the Lynx Strike starter deck when all we had were 3 Link monsters, Decode Docker pretty much being the only playable one. Yu-Gi-Oh was in a much different place. The format was kind of in a triangle format comprised of Zodiac, True Draco Zodiac, and True Draco Demise. These were the 3 dominating decks of the format. They had been dominating for like 6 months at this point, and it really just goes to show because these decks were absolutely incredible. But when Lynx summoning first hit the game, what's interesting about these 3 decks in particular is that they didn't necessarily get hindered by the introduction of Lynx summoning and Master Rule 4. Zodiac was very interesting because since we had a card like Zodiac Chakanine, Zodiac was able to play around the fact that the extra monster zone limited you to only having 1 monster out from your extra deck at a time, because basically you could just resurrect your Trident or something like that, and then you would have the ability to play around that and have multiple monsters from your extra deck onto the field. And then True Draco Zodiac kind of just took the best of both True Draco and Zodiac and made a really powerful deck out of it. It won the 2017 North American WCQ, but then you had a deck like True Draco, which didn't give a shit about the extra monster zone at all because it wasn't playing anything in the extra deck, so it could play cards like Monarchs Erupt, which are basically skill drain, to basically hard counter their Zodiac matchups. So that was kind of the thing. Even though we had these Link monsters and Link summoning was in full effect, the best decks of the format really didn't care that Link summoning existed, so it kind of just propelled these decks to an even more solidified tier 1 position and really pushed everything else beneath it because all of these other decks like Paleozoic, ABC, really got hindered by the fact that they had to kind of rely on these Link monsters to be able to summon out multiple of their boss monsters from the extra deck. But what's interesting is when we got our very first core set that introduced us to even more Link monsters, Code of the Duelist, Code of the Duelist didn't actually really shift the competitive landscape a whole lot. And you'd think for the very first core set that we're going to be getting that's introducing a brand new summoning mechanic, it's going to make a big impact. But funny enough, even though there was cards in here like Topologic Bomber Dragon named Girsu, and now the infamous Firewall Dragon, you know what the card that people were most excited about was? Mrs. Radiant. And you know why? Because Zodiac was one of the best decks of the format. It was comprised completely of Earth monsters and essentially facilitated OTKs for Zodiac and was basically the perfect Link monster to include into the deck. It just so happened that of all of the generic attribute Link 2s, Earth was the first archetype released, and it just so happens that it fit naturally into Zodiac. So even though Firewall Dragon is crazy as it is now, people really didn't care so much about Firewall Dragon as they did something like Mrs. Radiant, which was only a super rare, so just wrap your head around that. But what happened was not too long after Code of the Duelist's release was the fact that we had a ban list, and this put Zodiac Trident and Zodiac Broadbull to 0, basically phasing Zodiac out of competitive play, but Draco actually came out untouched. I think they might have hit Dynamite Knight and Ignis, but the thing is Masterpiece and Diagram were completely untouched, untouched, which basically just kept True Draco in a very powerful position moving into this new format. And it also gave rise to some other decks that people weren't really playing with before, like Pendulum Magician. But then this kind of got us to the next set, which really changed the competitive landscape, and I think it's the tipping point for when Lynx started to become the dominating force in the game, and that is Circuit Break. And that's all because of one card, Spiral Double Helix. Now, this wasn't really a surprise to us here in the TCG because anyone paying attention to the OCG saw that Spiral was basically a tier 0 deck. As soon as Spiral Double Helix was released in Japan, it just dominated their competitive scene, and it was just absolutely absurd. And so people kind of take note of that and realize that it was going to have that same effect here. And it really went to show at YCS Dallas when 29 of the top 32 slots were taken by Spiral. And I think YCS Bochum was very similar. I think with something around like 27 of the top 32 also being Spiral. But shortly after these events, there was a ban list, and it actually attempted to put Spiral in check. I believe Spiral Quick Fix and Spiral Drone both went to 1, and that was a really big deal, but it still didn't stop Spiral from being the strongest deck for the months to come. Now, it did give rise to some other decks to at least have a fighting chance, like Pendulum Magician and Trickstar, but because of cards like Spiral Resort and Spiral Sleeper, Spiral was just able to completely dominate the format for a time. And again, that's just because of one card. Spiral Double Helix just really unlocked the deck's potential and just made it absolutely crazy. Now, there was some other good Link monsters in Circuit Break like Borolo Dragon, which is a one of, but it's still a very important one of even to this day. But it's one of those things that wasn't really, you know, changing the game forever. It was kind of just something that you threw in your extra deck just to kind of have if you really needed it. But then what happened was we got to our next core set, and that's where things started to get really interesting because we kind of saw a repeat of Circuit Break in Extreme Force. And this time, rather than it being Spiral, it was Pendulum Magician. Now, a couple things happened here. The release of Heavy Metal Foe's Electromite in Extreme Force was absolutely monumental for Pendulum Magician's success, but we also saw the limitation of Spiral Resort going to 1, which really kind of helped put Spiral in check and gave way to Pendulum Magician's rise. One thing that was very interesting about Extreme Force is that because we didn't get the Link Vrains pack here in the TCG, they put a ton of the imports from that pack as OCG imports in Extreme Force. So this gave us cards like Heavy Metal Foe's Electromite, like Isolde, which is one of the most important Link to Warrior support cards we've ever seen, especially considering the current format. There's also stuff like Curious, and then even taking that aside, you have the cards that were exclusive to Extreme Force, like Saryuja Skulldread, one of the most powerful rank 4s, or Link 4s rather, that we have in the game, and also Underclock Taker, which is seemingly not that good, but very important because of the fact it's fairly generic. So we started to get this infusion of Link monsters into the game that really started shifting the competitive landscape tremendously. And not only did Heavy Metal Foe's Electromite push Pendulum Magician into the competitive forefront, but it also just enabled an FDK which would not be stopped for months on end and would basically allow Pendulum Magician to dominate the format. You also had decks like Trickstar though that were still able to compete because of the Link summoning mechanic thanks to a card like Scapegoat. Scapegoat would basically allow people to have access to 4 Link materials and basically be able to tutor any card out of the extra deck that they saw fit for any particular situation. And in tandem with a consistent engine like Trickstar, it was able to go toe-to-toe with some of these extremely powerful decks and still manage to top, despite the fact it didn't really do anything too broken. But this gets us to our last core set, and that was Flames of Destruction. And yet again, a core set would just completely shift the landscape of the competitive scene, for the better or the worse, depending on how you look at it. And that's because not really there was any one particular card to help one particular archetype, but rather there was a set of fairly pretty much generic monsters that any deck could incorporate. And I'm talking about the Nightmares. I think the Nightmares were one of the most just welcome inclusions into the Link summoning mechanic, because you now had access to, regardless of whatever deck you were playing, you had the ability to have access to spell and trap removal, monster removal, just pretty much anything you could possibly think of. It's built into the nightmares themselves. You have effect negation, you have additional normal summons. The fact that they can climb and chain into one another really just gave all these different decks access to the same toolbox to kind of help them deal with any particular situation. It's kind of the reason why Goki is the strongest deck of the current format, because Goki's had the potential to really just take over and abuse Link summoning, but they never really had any powerful monsters to link into. But then once the Nightmares were released, that completely changed things, and now you see that Goki is the strongest deck of the format. The last deck I wanted to talk about was Sky Strikers, introduced in Dark Saviors not long after Flames of Destruction, and the thing is, this is kind of the Link summoning equivalent to Zodiac, which freaked a lot of people out at first, but very similarly to how people would include cards like Zodiac Ratpier and Zodiac Barrage in realistically any deck just to have access to cards like Trident, you're seeing people include cards like Engage and Hornet Bit, as well as Kagari and Shizuku, just so they can play these very powerful generic Sky Striker cards that really generate a ton of advantage, and it's pretty much free, and that's what's really cool. I love when we get these generic cards that take advantage of a very good summoning mechanic, but don't really take away from being able to play any one particular strategy. And so again, Link summoning helped facilitate this whole entire mechanic and archetype, and while the deck can be played on its own, which is perfectly fine, you see it being played in Goki, in Trickstar, in a plethora of other decks, and that just really goes to show how prolific Link summoning is in terms of the effect that it's had on the game in general. It's crazy now when you look at all the top deck lists of the best competitive decks of the format, and you see that they're all completely dominated by Link monsters. I think in the past, if you look, when Synchro Summoning came out, when Xyz Summoning came out, it never was really this rapid. I think we never had this rate of conversion to a new summoning mechanic at this fast of pace. Now, to be fair, Link summoning does require you to use Link monsters to enable other cards from your extra deck, so maybe it's a bit more integrated in that respect, so it's kind of forcing it on you, and I think that was one of the biggest gripes that I personally had in the past, that it forces you to use Link monsters to take advantage of other mechanics. But 1 year later, even though we all had our gripes about Link summoning, and it's not the same game that we grew up with, that we knew and loved, I really think Link summoning has actually just done a lot for Yu-Gi-Oh! Now, obviously at the current moment, we have the fact that Goki can just extra link you and basically FTK you because you can't play the game, so obviously Link summoning isn't without its faults, but I definitely think that now that we have a very vast, large, and fairly generic pool of Link monsters at our disposal, it does a lot of really cool things, and a lot of these older strategies kind of have access to be able to play the way they were used to, but also have some new things that they can do as well, and giving them tools like the Nightmares or like these specific Link monsters that they never had access to before, so it kind of just completely changes how these decks work altogether, and really makes anyone who's a fan of a particular deck really happy to see that their deck can do some new things. So guys, those are just my thoughts. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think about Link summoning as a whole 1 year later. I'd really love to hear your thoughts. Guys, thank you so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always, subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh! Content, and if you found this video informative, consider backing me on Patreon, because just by pledging only $1 a month, you're investing in my ability to continue bringing you amazing Yu-Gi-Oh! Content. So thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time.